greetings, welcome, and thanks for inviting me once again to present this critical element of the comprehensive plan for Murfreesboro. So here is what is the latest iteration of the future land use map. I know there are a lot of different colors on here. We're basically looking at 17 different land use classifications. Those will be boiled down somewhat for the final iteration. We'll talk about that as well. We've also on this map included some proposed additional thoroughfares that will accommodate growth, particularly in the urban growth boundary area. Currently, Murfreesboro's population is somewhere around 124,000, 125,000. We're projecting by 2035, your population within the city limits will be just over 228,000 persons. Within the planning area, which is the city limits and the lands within the urban growth boundary, we're looking at a population of potentially up to 360 some persons. The goals we will go over, and I'll just read them to you very briefly. Goal 1, areas of community focus are established, which contain a mixture of compatible land uses providing for housing, commercial, institutional, public services, and recreation and leisure activities. Goal 2, individual property rights are balanced, of course, with community interests and goals. Goal 3, land uses, densities, and regulations promote efficient development patterns which in turn reduce municipal, state, governmental, and utility costs. Goal 4, land use patterns are established which increase transportation efficiency, encourage transit use, and decrease automobile dependency. Goal 5, community identity is enhanced through adherence to and enforcement of specific design standards which revitalize municipal districts, neighborhoods, and corridors, and establish city gateways and entryways to special districts. And Goal 6, open space is preserved in the outlying areas of the urban growth boundary in order to accommodate future growth beyond the 20-year horizon of this plan and create a defined boundary and sense of arrival to the community. Murfreesboro maintains the character and semblance of a freestanding community. Just succinctly defined, community character describes a continuum from rural to urban in which the relative balance of varying elements such as buildings, vehicular elements, and green space changes along that continuum from rural to urban. So here's a good diagram that I've shown you in the past where you have the three key elements. You have gray, brown, and green. In natural areas, it's predominantly all green space with a little bit of transportation corridors. But then in urban environments, your urban core, it's predominantly building mass, very little green, very contained green space, and a good percentage of gray areas, asphalt, concrete for transportation corridors. In between, in the suburban areas and the auto-urban areas, there is an abundance of gray area that basically surrounds your building mass, that kind of thing. So this is a good example of the difference between land use and character. Here we have two restaurants, so the land use is essentially the same, but the character is much different. The restaurant to the left is out on Medical Center Boulevard. It's more what we would call auto-urban general commercial. It's a very nice eating establishment, but it's surrounded by a parking lot. So compared to a restaurant that's down on the courthouse square, again, the land use is the same, but the character is strikingly different. This is just another quick example of the importance of understanding character in order to preserve it and work within certain character confines. This is a State Farm insurance building in a neighborhood in Lafayette, Louisiana, and I think it just shows how even with a neighborhood kind of commercial or office kind of land use, it can be built so that the character of the community can be seen within that building itself, with the pitched roof and parking lots have been well screened. It looks very residential in character. With respect to Murfreesboro zoning, you have some 31 zoning districts, 16 of which will allow some form of residential development. And then you have another 6 overlay districts. So what we're interested in doing is hopefully reducing the number of residential zoning districts by providing some development options to provide for developers that much greater flexibility in developing. And at the same time, enabling developers to preserve critical open space resources, forested areas, rivers, streams, wetlands, open space. So typically if we have your typical kind of standard residential development might consist of, in this case, you have 15 units, 2-acre lots, and the parcels basically extend from the road frontage all the way back to the back property line. You can also see that there's a river running through that area to the south. There's a forested area. The boundaries of these parcels really don't take or consider those kind of resources at all. If we provide some additional development options where we reduce the actual size of the parcel and really start focusing on the OSR, which is the open space ratio, we can start to cluster development a little bit and then preserve critical open space features for the enjoyment and recreation of the whole community. So here you have smaller lots. They've been reduced from 2 acres down to 1.5 acres, which would be virtually imperceptible from the road, but the lots are not as deep. But there is, in this case, there's a small trail that's going from the road down to this kind of open space green riparian corridor area. So that's with an increase in open space ratio of about 15%. So you can take it a little bit further, and here we have a 10,000 square foot residential development where the open space ratio has been increased to 65%, and in doing that you're preserving a lot more open space for the community, and the developer is also benefiting by being able to develop more units within this particular area. So this in general kind of illustrates what we're trying to suggest, is that by decreasing density somewhat from, let's say, 12,000 to 10,000 square feet, something that's visually imperceptible, when you do that across the city, you're creating a whole lot of land that can be then used or preserved for critical open space, parkland, that kind of thing. Again, the two critical elements, lot size and density. When you decrease the lot size, you're increasing density, whereby instead of having 16 parcels or units, you're shrinking them down to 20 units, but you're developing about 20% additional open space. We would do this within the same zoning district, so you wouldn't necessarily need this kind of development pattern. You wouldn't have to go for a rezoning for that, and that also increases your open space. So what we're suggesting here, particularly when it comes to RS15, RS12, and RS10 zoning districts, which are essentially your suburban zoning districts, we're suggesting that we have 3 development options whereby the RS15, 12, and 10 would all be able to be developed under one key zoning district. And those would be then development options permitted by right for the developer. So essentially when we were developing land use classifications, we embraced this to a certain degree with some of the zoning districts, whereby we have essentially 4 residential land use classifications. The suburban estate, basically, there's not a zoning district equivalent at this time, but it's essentially suburban development with a larger acreage, 1 to 3 plus acres parcels. Your suburban residential land use classification would include your RS15, RS12, RS10, for example. And then what we're calling auto-urban general residential would include potentially RS10, RS8, the more denser, the denser types of housing that you have, as well as districts in Murfreesboro. And then the auto-urban residential multifamily, which would equate to your RM 22, 12, and 16. The principal land uses, if you will, rural, agricultural, residential, commercial office, industrial, public institutional, and then parks and open space. So essentially, when it comes to a rural land use classification, we have a rural undeveloped character. When it comes to the suburban classification, we have suburban estate, suburban residential, and a suburban or neighborhood commercial character as well. Within an urban classification, we have the auto-urban general residential character that we just discussed, the auto-urban multifamily residential character, auto-urban general commercial, and then the urban commercial mixed use, which is a land use that we'll talk about here in a moment. When it comes to neighborhood conservation, we have 4 specific land use classifications based on density, and I'll explain this in just a moment, whereby the NC1 basically equates to your suburban estate when it comes to that same kind of density. We also have a business park classification, a light and heavy industrial classification, a public institutional, and then park and open space. So when you look at the legend on the future land use map, you'll see the box that's highlighted in the dashed line. The suburban estate does equate to NC1, and then NC4 equates to multifamily. So anything that's cross-hatched is what we're proposing to be for the land use to be. The NC1 through NC4 is all existing residential. So just to begin with the outline of the planning area, this shows of course, the city limits and the urban growth boundary. This is a map that we produced for Chapter 2. As I'm sure you remember, it shows all of the developed land within the planning area. About 42% of the planning area is developed, and that equates to about 48,934 acres. 2/3 of your development is residential of varying densities. 1/3 is non-residential, principally along your major transportation corridors. A couple of the key kind of concepts, I developed these diagrams to show that what we're trying to emulate or develop in the future land use map. You have some very strong transportation corridor spokes that are emanating from your downtown core. What we're depicting within the future land use map are a series of development nodes that would be connected to the beginnings of different beltways like Veterans Parkway, for example. These commercial development nodes would basically supply all of the key services, commercial, office, and other services for your suburban communities, but they'd also be attractors or magnets for communities outside of Murfreesboro as well. Secondly, we're wanting to just perpetuate the continued centralized development within your commercial core and in between your 2 major north-south transportation corridors, to where people are living on either side of that in West Murfreesboro and East Murfreesboro, but essentially working in the center. At a particular meeting we had, we got all of the department heads together and decided upon what were the key areas that were going to be developable over the next 20 years. And as a result, we developed a growth sequencing program. These are the main areas of focus for this 20-year comprehensive plan. So all in all, the land that we're talking about developing within the next 20 years represents about a little over 31,000 acres, 31,758 acres. And I just wanted to throw this slide in to remind you, this came out of Chapter 2, the Growth, Capacity, and Infrastructure chapter, but it just shows the areas where there is readily accessible municipal services, mainly for fire protection and potable water. But the red areas are the areas where there's the least amount of infrastructure, and it'll take the longest time to get to those areas. So all of the other areas outside of the growth sequencing program, we have utilized the land use classification of undeveloped. We had called it rural agricultural, but we've decided to just call it undeveloped land. This land use classification, NC1, is the rural estate classification for existing large lot residential areas within the mainly within the urban growth boundary, and that makes up about 12.9% of the developed area. And that 12.9%, that's not of the whole developed area, that's of the 48,934 developed acres right now. The suburban estate is what we're proposing. We are proposing a little bit, you can see in the southwestern quadrant of the city, and there's a little bit over to the southeast and the east, but this is mainly because of the lack of readily accessible municipal services. Your NC2 is all of your existing RS15, RS12 zoned suburban areas. And this is what we're proposing to be a continuation of that same density of residential development, which we're calling, again, suburban residential, to the tune of a little over 14,000 acres, or 44% of the growth sequencing area. NC3 is your auto-urban, your higher density residential, of which there's not that much in Murfreesboro now, although it's a development type that is probably currently underutilized. We are proposing a very large urban commercial mixed-use development right at the intersection of Veterans Parkway and New Salem Pike. So that's why we're surrounding that area with higher density residential development. NC4 is all of your existing multifamily development right now. It makes up 1.7% of your developed lands within the city limits. And we are proposing a little bit more than that, about 3% of, again, that 31,000 acres within the growth sequencing area. Auto-urban general commercial, as we've talked about in the past, this consists of like the kind of commercial development that you would see not in your urban core like downtown, but out Old Fort Parkway, to some extent along Medical Center Boulevard, etc. So we have 7.6% in base year 2015 is auto-urban general commercial. So now we have a little bit less than that, 6.7%, but that's certainly complemented by your urban commercial mixed-use development as well. Here, this urban commercial mixed-use classification, what we are proposing is some significant redevelopment along key commercial corridors. We've built that into the base year 2015, so that's why you have such a large amount right there. But then we're also proposing an additional 3,500 acres of, again, urban commercial mixed use. And this would be of the character that you might find, the development intensity you might find in your downtown Courthouse Square kind of area, as far as the amount of setbacks of buildings. It would definitely require structured parking and some on-street parking, but and then also some significant residential, high-density residential development. So we were talking about a floor-to-area ratio of potentially up to 4, where buildings are no taller than about 95 feet, and densities would be no more or greater than 45 dwelling units per acre. So we're talking about up to 6, 7, 8-story tall residential towers. Originally we had, as you may remember, we had included light industrial with business park, and we've since, in working with city staff, planning department, we've decided to not have light industrial in the business park. We usually build light industrial into a business park or office park kind of land use classification because it is somewhat suburban in character, and it also, in doing that, you can ensure a higher quality of light industrial development. But at the same time, we completely understand why the city would want to have a special or a specific office or business park land use classification. So that's what you see here, and most of it is, there's some, as you can see, down around Joe B. Jackson. Much of it is going to be along future portions of Veterans Parkway, and then up around the 840 intersection. But right now, base year, we're suggesting that you have currently about 3.4% office park, and we're proposing basically the same amount. Light industrial, and I know this is difficult to see, but most of it is down along the Joe B. Jackson area, extending up through downtown. Heavy industrial is mainly your extractive industries. We did include the solid waste landfill, but we haven't included, we have added about a little over 500 acres of heavy industrial. There are some staff that would like to see a little bit more heavy industrial, which I can completely appreciate, but it's making sure that it's in compatible areas that may be further along the railroad track, those kind of areas. Public institutional, this is a little bit of a reach here. In base year 2015, we have a little over 4,900 acres of public institutional. We haven't shown, we know based on our analyses in Chapter 2 that we're going to need a little over 1,000 acres of additional schools, elementary, middle, and high schools. And I can't remember how many high schools we were talking about, a significant number, but we chose not to locate those on this future land use map just because it's too amorphous right now. So we do know that we're going to need at least 1,025 acres for schools, but then there are also additional police stations, fire stations, that kind of public institutional land use that this map is not showing. Likewise with parks and open space, currently base year 2015, somewhere around 1,100 acres, and we've shown the principal parks, some of the greenways as well as some of the proposed greenways. We haven't identified specifically where additional parks would be located at this time. What we call the Downtown East Neighborhood Redevelopment Program. We originally had a neighborhood restoration land use classification, and we decided to take that out. But these were for areas, neighborhoods that may require some municipal intervention. So we were mainly looking at, for example, the neighborhood from Main Street south to around Mercury. This whole downtown east neighborhood is a very intact neighborhood. It has a whole lot more sidewalks than most of the neighborhoods around Murfreesboro. It has a plethora of neighborhood commercial, parks, schools. It's like your quintessential kind of neighborhood, what we'd like to see, although it's in need of a facelift in some areas. And so that's why we're suggesting that while it has all the right bones, it has good structure, a good mix of land uses, it still needs some work. The Downtown Central Business District, we are suggesting a very high density, high intensity development, urban commercial mixed use, but then some traditional general commercial, auto urban general commercial land uses as well. Of course, we've talked about the Bottoms area, a huge opportunity there. a lot of really marginal land, some land uses that may be best suited for other parts of the city. We have perpetuated some of the elements of the new Salem Pike future land use plan or future land use map, whereby we are suggesting a very high density, high intensity urban commercial mixed use node right at the intersection of Veterans Parkway and New Salem Pike, surrounded by a little bit higher density auto urban residential development around that. Similarly, we borrowed from the Blackman future land use map, not only from the future land use map, but a lot of the principles that went into the development of the original map. We're encouraging business park development at the key intersection here at 840, followed by some additional general commercial and some urban commercial mixed use. We're also proposing a student village that would again be a high density, high intensity student village that would provide students a place to go, you know, in the evenings, maybe student unions, other places like t-shirt shops, to nightclubs, to all those activities that students currently really don't have immediately around MTSU. This corridor, this part of West Broad from Medical Center Boulevard all the way up to Thompson Lane, it's basically a bunch of very marginal development, auto parts stores, that kind of thing. Although you have a recreational trail system that's totally intact, we could see this all being redeveloped in some sort of mixed-use urban commercial fashion where you would have a high-density residential component. And flanking that, again, would be the West College Street mixed-use redevelopment program, and this is where I wanted to refer to all of these areas where you have fairly marginal manufactured home parks that are not in very good shape at all. But again, a lot of marginal development along College that could go elsewhere if there was a developer that was really interested in aggregating the requisite property and completely redeveloping this area. So what we're going to do with this land use map after it's finally approved is we're then going to overlay that map with the Metropolitan Planning Organization's traffic analysis zones. And what we're going to do then is basically start to evaluate and discern what trip generation is going to result as a result of these proposed land uses. Then we're going to take that and our sub-consultants, Neil Schaefer, will build that into their transportation model, and we'll really start to understand, are your current thoroughfares large enough to basically accommodate all of this new development? Or will some corridors need to be expanded? Are you going to need new corridors? Where is that going to be, et cetera? Here is your MPO's 2010, when it comes to population, they identified where they thought you were going to have the most growth within the various TAZs. And so the darker red or rust-colored TAZs represent your highest growth areas. Now let me just show you what they were proposing for 2040. You can see a lot of significant, the MPO was suggesting here that in this traffic analysis zone up here, there's going to be a whole lot of additional residential development down here, et cetera. So that's why this exercise is so important, is that we really need to make sure that we're all on the same page, because when it comes to developing thoroughfares, you know, it's a very costly enterprise. But so I identified or outlined the key TAZs that are destined to be the highest populated, and you can see these are the areas where there's barely any population at all. These were the secondary kind of TAZs. And then when you look at the future land use map, they're still relatively undeveloped. And so this will be very helpful for the Metropolitan Planning Organization as well. Likewise with employment. In 2010, this was where most of the employment was centered. This is what the MPO believes where you'll have additional employment centers. There is a section on, as I'd mentioned, we had identified the key transportation corridors leading into the city and where we might have significant gateway entrance features. These could be as small as just a sign, or they could be as large as a welcome center. And so we laid out a series of principles and criteria through which to identify those particular areas and what might go there to, again, celebrating the entrance into Murfreesboro.